In places like Los Padres National Forest, experienced hikers disappear without a trace. Shady characters wait in the hills, stalking anyone careless enough to make a mistake, and most mysteriously, ominous figures too tall to be humans surveying the wilderness from the tops of ridges. This video will take you through multiple cases, some stretching back before recorded history, showing that something stalks Big Sur. Something old, dark, and preying on our worst fears. I'm Josh D'Anocchio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. On the morning of August 6th, 2014, a 51-year-old man named Arvin Nelson slipped on his blue backpack in Los Padres National Forest. A friend had just dropped him off at the China Camp trailhead, and Arvin was about to begin the trip of a lifetime, a week-long solo hike through the Ventana Wilderness, which is a remote section of the Big Sur that he had never explored before, despite being as experienced as he was. Now, although he hadn't chosen this specific route before, he wasn't just a regular guy passing through. He was a fixture in the Big Sur community. Standing 6'3" and around 200 pounds, he was physically imposing. But it was his personality that really stood out, because he had lived in the area for years, working at the Big Sur River Inn. And even during slower seasons, he would substitute teach in Los Gatos for a little extra money. Just about everyone who knew Arvin had a story about him. Most described him as a joyful presence to be around. He loved playing his harmonica and would often join bands, both local and national touring groups, whenever they wanted someone to jump in. And when the Big Sur community faced hardships like fires, mudslides, or storms, Arvin was always there to help. As Arvin began hiking that August morning, he felt very prepared for the journey. And he should have, because not only was he very experienced, but he had packed plenty of food and water for the entire week. Like any veteran of the trails, he had explicitly told his friends before leaving that if they didn't hear from him by August 14th, when he was scheduled to arrive at Big Sur Station, they should report him missing. His trip was off to a great start, and later that first day, as Arvin was making his way through the Pine Valley, he began noticing an odd sound. Now, to his surprise, it was music, but not a recording. It was live music. And curious, he followed the sound and he came upon a cabin belonging to Jack English, who was a man who had lived in this isolated spot for 13 years. And Jack's son, Dennis, was visiting. Jack lived there alone, making high-end bows for violins. Well, the three men quickly hit it off. In fact, Arvin pulled out his harmonica and joined in the music making, and what started as a chance encounter turned into an overnight stay. The following day, Arvin continued hanging out with Jack and Dennis, playing some more music and exploring the trails around Pine Valley. Their time together was one of those unexpected connections that makes a solo hike so memorable. But on August 8th, Jack and Dennis were scheduled to leave the cabin. A helicopter arrived to pick them up, a convenient mode of transportation from such a remote location if you've got the money to burn. And when asked what he planned to do after they left, Arvin told Dennis that he planned to stay in the area through Saturday, August 9th. On Sunday, he would hike the 11 miles to Sykes Hot Springs. They quickly exchanged goodbyes before boarding the helicopter and taking off, watching as Arvin waved goodbye. Fast forward to August 14th, the day Arvin was supposed to arrive at Big Sur Station, and he never showed up. And in fact, he made no contact with anyone. But, as per his instructions, a friend had reported him missing to law enforcement 2 days after. The search effort that mobilized was massive. Multiple agencies became involved, deploying 1 airplane, 3 choppers, and about 30 ground searchers who combed the wilderness daily. Special focus was placed on the Sykes Trail that Arvin had planned to hike, since it was known to be strenuous, typically taking around 6 hours to complete. Now, this was because it required hikers to cross the Big Sur River multiple times, a waterway that could be dangerous with its high and fast-flowing current. And on top of that, trees frequently fell across the path, making navigation challenging, even for people like Arvin. Unfortunately, 6 days came and went without any sign of the missing hiker. On August 22nd, Commander John Thornburg of the Monterey County Sheriff's Office announced that they might have to look for Arvin longer than initially planned. I mean, in some ways, this was great news. It meant that law enforcement acknowledged that Arvin was well provisioned for his hike and had the supplies and experience to survive. But Thornburg also admitted that these searchers themselves faced significant challenges. The wilderness area they had to search in was vast and covered in dense vegetation. But despite the obstacles, officials had hope, saying that they still believed Arvin might be alive. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. You guys know how the saying goes. And all the while, there was no trace of Arvin ever found. No backpack, no clothing, not a single item that he had ever carried with him. The widest accepted theory is that he somehow got injured or maybe fell off one of the steep coastal cliffs into the ocean or off the riverbanks into the Big Sur. It would make sense because as heavy as his backpack was, he wouldn't have stood a chance. However, it's widely agreed by his friends and a lot of the community that he did not harm himself. So it's also possible there could have been an animal attack, though there was no evidence ever emerging to support that theory. Another theory is foul play, and there was no shortage of candidates, from drug runners protecting illegal grow-ops to survivalists playing war games. And in fact, some have even suggested that Arvin's pit stop at Jack English's cabin was his undoing. As disturbing as it is to consider Arvin Nelson meeting foul play, it does pale in comparison to other explanations. Because if folklore and eyewitnesses from coastal California are to be believed, Arvin may have run into a fate worse than death. To this day, we still have no idea what happened to this man. Many years ago, a young California man named Kyle and his friend Cam were driving through a dirt field in a beat-up Volkswagen Bug. They weren't doing anything in particular, just killing time. Now, this section of town, an area known as the Old East Part, was locally famous for its old abandoned barns that people claimed were haunted, and Kyle had always heard these stories growing up, but, he never really gave them much thought. Well, things were running smoothly until the car started making this horrible grinding sound. And it wasn't long before the thing just died on them completely. Even though Kyle wasn't superstitious, the timing could not have been worse. By this point, dusk had fallen and the sun was rapidly setting. And here they were, stuck in the middle of an isolated dirt field, a field not far from these supposedly haunted barns. Kyle and Cam had to make a quick decision about what to do next. And because this was way before cell phones, they couldn't just call for help. And they just started talking back and forth thinking, what are we going to do? We're going to be stuck out here. We're going to have to try and walk our way through the darkness to get to a payphone. They had the realization that if they did, they could risk getting completely lost in this unfamiliar place at night. And after discussing their options, they decided that the safest choice was to just sleep in the car overnight and that maybe somebody would find them in the morning. And they could figure things out when they could actually see where they were going, if anything else. Since they're in the middle of nowhere, miles from any house, it gets pitch black once night has fully fallen. And neither Kyle nor Cam are having a lot of success sleeping. So, to try and fight their insomnia, they keep popping in and out of the car, sometimes alone, sometimes both at once, sometimes smoking, other times talking, other times just stargazing. At some point during the night, something very strange begins to happen. Kyle and Cam are inside the car when they first notice, and Kyle is looking out the window when he spots what seem to be these vague shadows gathering around the vehicle. And he looks more carefully and realizes that these shadows are actually arranged in a perfect circle around their car. And they aren't small either. They're at least the size of the car, but they sure as heck aren't cars, and they don't seem like cows either. Even stranger is that they seem to be hunched or kneeling on the ground and are perfectly evenly spaced all around the car. Kyle is just suspecting that either he's going crazy, there's sleep deprivation, his eyes are playing tricks on him, this can't be real. So for validation, he's like nudging Cam and he's pointing out at these things and he's like, do you see what I'm saying, or am I going crazy? Initially, Cam agrees it's just a trick of the light, but Kyle wants to put that theory to the test. They both decide to step out of the car and investigate. Both men step out into the night air and they walk around the vehicle. They're keeping an eye on the shadows, leaning in, trying to figure out if what they are seeing is maybe an optical illusion caused by moonlight, or maybe just shadows from rocks or the desert scrub. But no matter how they look at these shapes formed around them, they can't explain this. The shadows remain completely still, forming that perfect circle. They don't move, they don't make a sound, they just stay in this position. Thoroughly creeped out by this, Kyle and Cam get back in the car and they're really creeped out. For the rest of the night, they keep peering out the windows, watching these, and the shadows don't move at all. They just remain in the single position they're in, and at some point during the night, while both Cam and Kyle were asleep, they disappear, because the next morning they were gone. Neither Cam or Kyle have no explanation for what these shadows were, or what they meant, or why they surrounded the car in a perfect circle, and it's unclear what these things wanted from them, or if they had any relation at all to the haunted farm nearby. Folks, it remains a mystery. One afternoon in 2005, a woman named Elizabeth Benitez was sitting in the passenger seat of her friend's car as they drove north on Highway 101 along the California coast. Elizabeth lived in San Mateo, and she and her friend had just spent a weekend in Los Angeles. Now, they were on their way back home, with Elizabeth's friend doing all the driving for the return trip. As they passed through San Luis Obispo, which is about halfway between Los Angeles and San Mateo, Elizabeth is enjoying watching the mountains running alongside the highway. It's in the middle of the day, the sky is clear, and she can see for miles across the golden hills of Central California. But as she continues staring out the window, she notices something strange standing on one of the mountain ridges off in the distance. It looks like a person because it's shaped like a person, but the longer she stares at it, she's thinking that, okay, this definitely can't be a person. The figure is large, and I mean unusually large, much bigger than a human should appear, and especially at that distance. It wears what looks like a black cape, one that reminds Elizabeth of something that the Grim Reaper might wear. And it's standing in a leaning posture and seems to be holding onto what looks like a staff or maybe a walking stick. Near where it is standing is what appears to be a small puddle of water, though it's hard to tell for sure from how far away they are. And this figure is intensely black. Even though it's in the middle of the day and everything else is clearly visible in the sunlight, it is so black that it reminds Elizabeth of a raven, only darker. To ensure she's not crazy, she doesn't tell her friend what she has seen. She just simply says, "Hey, look over there at the mountains." And her friend, at the time who's focused on driving, manages to glance in the direction she points for about 5 seconds before turning back to the road. And after her friend looks away from the mountains, Elizabeth asks her what she saw, being extra careful not to give any hints about what she herself has observed. Her friend describes exactly the same thing that she saw, down to every specific detail. And in just those few seconds after looking away from the figure, Elizabeth's friend nearly loses control of the car. She swerves slightly and has to grip the steering wheel tightly to stay in her lane. Obviously, it has disturbed her as much as it disturbed Elizabeth. And now, Elizabeth is convinced that they have both seen something strange. So she begs her friend to turn the car around so they can go back and get a better look. But her friend refuses and tells her that she's just too tired from driving and she just wants to go home. Or at least, that's what the excuse was. During the drive back, Elizabeth tried to talk to her friend about it and ask her, what does she think it was? Was it a ghost? Was it a rock? I mean, it didn't really make much sense because they both saw the same thing, but her friend was pretty creeped out by it and didn't want to talk about it at all. And even for the longest time after this, she tried to find a name for it, but she didn't have one. Well, as it turns out, it already had a name, and that was how Elizabeth learned about the Dark Watchers of California. What exactly are the Dark Watchers? Well, nobody knows for sure. The Dark Watchers are said to be these figures that silently observe travelers from a distance, often positioned along the horizon of California's Santa Lucia mountain range. No one knows what they look like up close, and most of the time they vanish whenever someone approaches. Otherwise, they seem to lack distinctive features other than their wide-brimmed hats and the walking sticks that they carry. Sightings most commonly occur during the early hours of dawn or in the hours of twilight, although they are sometimes linked to the local Chumash people who historically lived along California's central and southern coast. No clear equivalent to the Dark Watchers appeared in their recorded mythology. That doesn't mean they aren't old, though. Strangely, they still appeared to Spanish settlers who arrived in the region, earning them the name Los Vigilantes Oscuros, or the Dark Watchers. Whatever they represent, these things aren't just another urban legend. They are one of the more persistent parts of this area in America, with tons of sightings over the years, and some even from celebrities. For example, famous California author John Steinbeck has incorporated these things into his writing, as did his son Thomas, who claimed to have actually witnessed them firsthand during his childhood. One of the more recent sightings of the Dark Watchers happened in September of 2010. A man named Brian was sitting in the passenger seat of his sister's car as they drove along San Juan Grade Road toward their home in Hollister, California. And at some point, Brian looked out the window and noticed something very unusual at the edge of the mountains up ahead. He thought that he was looking at a huge condor, but the closer they got, he realized that what he had spotted was not a condor, but instead something far more human looking. Now you have to remember that at the time, even though Brian lived in Hollister, he actually worked in a place called Salinas, which meant that he knew every area of this road because he had to drive it so much. And this wasn't like a straight shot, it actually wound through some pretty mountainous terrain. The roadside had barbed wire fencing installed along most of it, and there were these narrow sections near the cliffs that had very limited places where you could turn around. And just a few days before this, his car had broken down, so his sister had offered to drive him to and from work until he got his car back. And I'm mentioning this because Brian had more opportunity to study his surroundings than he normally could on his commute, and was able to stay focused on this thing along the ridgeline. And as they got closer to whatever it was, he could tell that it clearly was a figure, and in fact, standing near the barbed wire fence. And it was still completely still, facing away from the road, just staring off into the distant valleys and mountains. It actually appeared to be looking toward Fremont's Peak, which was visible from the road. And the closer they got, the more details Brian could make out. For one, it was completely dark and tall, incredibly tall, probably at least 10 feet, maybe more, and it appeared to be wearing something like a cape, because he could see the outline on its shoulders, which, by the way, were unusually straight and very broad. And it also seemed to kind of have a hunchback. And Brian told his sister, hey, you need to slow down as they approached, but the figure never turned around or even acknowledged their presence in any way. It just continued staring off into the distance toward the mountains. Brian wasn't immediately like, oh my gosh, this is the Dark Watchers. He was just like, who is this? What is this? And he started thinking that if this was a person, their behavior was strange, because not only were they staring, but the fact that they're on the other side of the fence, people just don't cross over that side of the barbed wire fence area. He knew that whatever it was extraordinary, and he began discussing this with his sister, and he's like, you know what, we got to get a better look. And so they started looking for a place to turn around, which unfortunately seemed to take forever. By the time they found a spot, the figure was gone, and there was no trace of where it went or how it vanished. It's not like it could have just ran off. I mean, there was just cliff there, so it would be impossible for something so large and so dark to just simply hide. Well, Brian would later record and share his experience, but unfortunately, the identity of the strange figure remained unknown. Was it the Dark Watchers, or was it something else? We don't know, folks. It remains a mystery. In 2003, a teenager named Daniel was hiking in the mountain ranges near his home just outside of Blythe, California. Although this is far to the south and way inland from the Dark Watchers' usual territory, he still thinks it's the best explanation for what happened that day. Dan lived about 7 miles outside the city, in an area that was basically just desert and mountains as far as the eye could see. Like a lot of teenagers with free time, Daniel made hiking in the desert areas near his home a regular activity. Over time, he became very familiar with the routes and areas that he would explore, although he typically self-enforced personal limits to how far he would go. But on the day in question, he decided that he was going to be a bit more adventurous than usual, and he really wanted to push those boundaries and see what was deeper in the mountain range. So he hiked further and further until at last he found himself in this very remote section where there weren't really that many roads or tracks. It was pretty much untouched wilderness. And as he was making his way through this area, he began to get this overwhelming sensation that someone or something was watching him, and his body reacted. The hairs on his arms stood up, and he kind of felt really nervous, and he started looking around for whatever would be causing this. And the first thing running through his mind is that there's a mountain lion stalking me. I'm about to die. It was definitely a possibility in the area at this time. And so as he's carefully scanning all around him, looking for this mountain lion, something in him told him to look upward toward the top of the nearest mountain. And he did, and there he noticed what appeared to be a small cave kind of nestled in the opening of a sheer rock wall. That cave would have offered a perfect view overlooking the valley below, including the exact spot where Daniel was standing at the time. And so he's getting this weird feeling that who or whatever is watching him is from that cave, and he's like, okay, that's a mountain lion's den, and it's going to come down here, it's going to kill me, and then it's going to drag me back up there. And so he's looking up at it, looking for signs of that mountain lion, but he doesn't see the mountain lion. He instead sees something else that made him freeze in place, because in that cave opening was a dark hooded figure looking out over the valley. I mean, Dan could barely make out the details of the figure's face, or at least the fact that it seemed to be covered by what looked like a thin veil. The hood and cloak it wore were all tattered and ripped, as though it had been worn continuously for very, very long periods of time. One of the strangest parts of all of this, even though Daniel was clearly visible from where this thing was, it was perfectly stationary, and it didn't even turn to look at him or acknowledge that he was there. For whatever reason, this was more than Daniel could handle, and he can't explain it, but he just had this overwhelming sensation that he wasn't looking at a person or a human being, that it was something evil. And his body reacted. He spun around and just quickly started going back the way he came. The entire time he's walking back, he had to really take deep breaths and try to talk himself out of hyperventilating and panicking, and he's just trying to stay focused on the trail as best he can until he made it back to more familiar territory. After that day, he never went beyond the trails that he knew, and specifically that part of the mountain range, because he has no idea if that thing is still there. One afternoon, a man named Mark decided to hike a remote trail in Ojai, California. The trail was located off Highway 33 and was known for being fairly isolated, at least on the weekdays. So it wasn't a surprise that Mark was mostly alone when he drove out to the trailhead, parked, and began making his way up. After about an hour, he found himself pretty far up the trail. He hadn't seen a single person, and it was pretty deserted. Just him, the trail, and the mountain above him. It was the kind of isolation that usually feels peaceful, but on this day, everything felt off. There was just this energy or vibe in the... This vibe, man. There was just an energy in the air that just felt wrong. As he continued on his hike, he suddenly got this really unsettling feeling, like, you know, the sensation you get when you know someone is staring at you, except he hadn't seen anyone else all day. It was like going from 0 to 100 in a second, and the feeling was so strong that he stopped hiking and he started looking around, and he's trying to figure out, why is he having this feeling? Because there's nobody around. It doesn't make sense. For whatever reason, just like in the last story, his eyes feel drawn toward the top of the mountain. And way up there, he saw what everybody else did. A black figure at the summit, and from this distance, it was just kind of a dark silhouette against the sky. Stationary, but unmistakable. And despite how far away it was, he could clearly make out this figure standing directly at the peak. His first instinct, oddly enough, was to wave at this figure. I mean, maybe he thought it was another hiker who had somehow reached the summit using a different trail, but what happened next completely caught him off guard. The black figure waved back. It was a perfectly natural response, but it didn't seem right. It was too perfect, like a mirror image of its own wave. And now he just began questioning his sanity, like, there's no way this is weird. And he's like, you know what? I'm just hallucinating. I'm clearly seeing something that isn't there. I haven't drank enough water. Maybe this is a tree moving in the wind. It happens. But there was just something that was so deliberate about the movement that really made him doubt any of these logical explanations. Look, we all have our bad habits, right? And Mark, even though he's a hiker, he had a habit that he's trying to kick. He pulls a cigarette out from his pocket, he lights it, takes a long drag, and then exhales the smoke, all while keeping his eyes fixated on it. And this is what happens next. Somehow, mere seconds after he exhales, the black figure also appears to blow out a puff of smoke. I mean, it's unmistakable. Even from this distance, he could just see this thick, visible plume emerging from where the head should be. And now he is freaked. This mirrored action confirmed that it wasn't standing there, that it was actually mimicking him. And within seconds, it begins to move. But it doesn't move like a person would. Its movements are fluid and flowing, like it floated or hovered above the ground. And probably the strangest of all is that it began moving vertically along the ridge, straight down the face of the mountain. Mark is absolutely freaked out by what he's seeing, and without hesitating, he gets the hell out of Dodge. He turns around and runs all the way back down the trail toward his car, and once he gets back, gets in his car and speeds far away from there. Lucky for him, the Dark Watchers, they don't chase, they don't speak, and only rarely do they move. They simply appear, and when they do, they bring with them a silence that somehow feels ancient and a presence impossible to explain. Whether they're guardians, warnings, or something far more sinister, nobody knows. But if you ever find yourself hiking alone in Big Sur and you feel like something is watching you from the ridgeline above, don't look too long, because some things look back. And because you guys have made it this far into the episode, I want you to all comment below Dark Watchers. So that way, I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy content like this, where we deep dive into witness cases or just strange stories of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.